Hi everyone, this is Stephanie Kim from CommunityConnect Labs, and I'm so excited to see how many people have logged on here to learn what cities and counties can do to ensure a complete and accurate count for Census 2020. So a little bit about us first. CommunityConnect Labs is a nonprofit technology provider and consulting group based in California. So counties, city, and nonprofit organizations utilize our products and services to do outreach, screening, and enrollment into low-income assistance programs like Earned Income Tax Credit, as well as surveys to inform programs, policies, and funding. But as you can probably tell by the fact that we're hosting this webinar, we've been doing some work around the census, and that's what we're excited to share with you today. We've built some tools with the U.S. Census Bureau's input and feedback, and this past summer, we worked with 9 cities and counties across the country, including Los Angeles County, City of San Jose, and the City of Central Falls, Rhode Island, to launch their first community-based address canvassing survey for the LUCA program, which is the local update of census addresses. From that, we fielded over 1,000 volunteers and government staff and over 40 community-based organizations to submit 15,000 records of so-called unconventional housing units to be considered for the master address file. So again, we enable government and nonprofit service providers to engage low-income and hard-to-reach communities using mobile messaging solutions. But today, we're going to talk about census. So I'm joined by my colleagues, Jacob Modell, who's the Vice President of Data and Research at CommunityConnect Labs, and also by Claire Ross, who is the Partnership Specialist for the U.S. Census Bureau's National Partnership Program, to discuss what's next for Census 2020 and what roles cities, counties, and nonprofits can play to ensure a fair and accurate count in their communities. So I'll start with a little Census 201 to bring everyone up to speed, but I'd like us to focus the majority of the hour on some practical solutions that you can take away and apply to your own local and regional strategies. So the first will be around maximizing the impact of your local complete count committees. The second will be around supporting the massive hiring needs for Census 2020. And then Jacob will give a preview of the tools we're currently developing as part of the Census Accelerator program. And then lastly, Claire will share how you can use the Census Solutions Workshop to kickstart all of this activity that we're going to be speaking about. We're going to try to have at least 15 minutes at the end for Q&A, so please send all of your questions using that question box on the side of your webinar panel as you think of them, and then we'll try to address them during Q&A at the end. We'll also share the deck and the recording following this webinar. So, okay, most of you have signed up for this webinar because you know what's already on this slide. There is a lot at stake when it comes to Census 2020, from federal funding for public programs to political representation. Funding-wise, this is an example of the types of programs that are affected by the census count when we are in the state of California. We're looking at $76 billion a year that is allocated to public services like highways and Head Start. 2/3 of the funding goes to healthcare, and the majority of the remainder goes to programs that impact children. A GW study calculates that each person not counted in the census could cost their state almost $2,000 per resident per year for the next 10 years in federal funding that goes to these services. And that adds up. A PwC study found that the 2000 census undercount cost the state of California $1.5 billion in federal revenue over the next decade. So it's understood that while states and communities might not stand to gain funding or congressional seats as a result of the 2020 census, the numbers show that there can be a lot to lose. The U.S. Government Accountability Office rated the 2020 census as high risk, and it has been projected that the self-response rate in hard-to-count communities could be as low as 60%. The end-to-end test in Rhode Island yielded some positive results. They slightly exceeded the target self-response rate, and the enumerators exceeded the productivity projections thanks to the new technology. But the Bureau's kiosk and email efforts yielded very few responses, and the Bureau was only able to meet 67% of its targeted field staff hiring goals. Now, especially given that this is the first online census, there were supposed to be 3 of these field tests to really iron out the new technologies and processes, but due to budget constraints, they were canceled. So based on this information, we've determined that the path to a complete and accurate count in 2020, there's 2 major tasks that we're working with local government and community-based organizations to deliver. The first task is quite obvious at this point. It's encouraging and supporting individuals from hard-to-count communities to participate in spite of the negative public opinion, fear around the citizenship question, and the digital divide. Logistically, that means figuring out how local trusted messengers can deliver targeted and consistent messaging campaigns at scale and provide last mile resources such as in-person assistance where needed in the languages that are needed. The second task is lesser known, but we cannot stress enough how important it is, and that's around supporting the recruitment and hiring of up to 500,000 field staff nationwide, the vast majority of whom will be census enumerators. Especially given how much more that enumerators will be responsible for in 2020 compared to 2010, recruiting local bilingual candidates from hard-to-count communities will be our best bet to ensuring a successful enumeration. However, there's some challenges to overcome. We have a strong economy and low employment rate, so even recruiting the staff who will serve to recruit enumerators is already proving to be a challenge. So Jacob will speak a little more about the enumerator recruitment opportunity in a moment, but I wanted to dive first really quickly into the first strategy that we are looking at, which is forming regional and local complete count committees. So we had the opportunity to interview a few experts around this. Quite a few of them worked on the 2010 census, the 2000 census, and they've seen a lot of complete count committees come and go. And they gave us some recommendations that we wanted to float up to here. The Census Bureau does provide a lot of resources around complete count committees, so look it up online and see what you could find there. But here we wanted to distill some other findings that we weren't able to find necessarily online. The first set of recommendations was really around committee makeup. So really making sure to, once you identify your target market segments in your community, bringing in the leaders to create, from those market segments to create and distribute locally tailored messages. So a lot of these committees, it's easy to think about who's in leadership in the region and just have them come together and form these strategies. But what we heard time and time again through our interviews was that it was essential to include the people on the ground to actually craft the strategy, because they will be the ones to deliver it. There was a lot of emphasis around bringing together experts from diverse sectors who are not only willing to just come in and talk and to bring their expertise, but who are also willing to bring their assets to the table and who can execute. There was very strong emphasis on how a lot of these committees can come together, and there are a lot of great ideas that can form, but it's the execution which is what really trips people up. And so our recommendation will be to really make sure that these committees are action-oriented and that they are formed to address all the distinct challenges. And this means creating a subcommittee specifically around enumerator recruitment, given how big of a challenge that will be on its own. The second set of recommendations provided to us from our interviews was around the types of resources needed to support these complete count committees. So there was a lot of emphasis on bringing in sponsorship funding to fund local grassroots outreach. To fund local grassroots outreach. Try to say that quickly 10 times. But also additional resources for research, message testing, technology, and data. So there are a lot of regional groups and national groups that are doing message testing, but again, it comes down to the makeup of your community and the various hard-to-count groups there, how to specifically reach them. That will need some additional digging and exploring before you're forming your strategy. This one I kind of laughed at when I saw, but it's true. There was emphasis on making sure that you have enough funding for the coffee and pastries. People really enjoy those and appreciate those. The last set of recommendations that were given to us were around including local voices. So making sure that once complete count committees have been formed, letting these meetings be public and inviting other folks in the community who might be able to attend and provide input. There was emphasis on leveraging existing message delivery methods that meet audiences where they are. So if there's already a program or an event or a type of interaction with social services that's going to provide a touch point and an opportunity to share about the census, take advantage of those where you can. And lastly, there was a reminder for us to make sure that everyone remembers that complete count committees serve as a connection between the city and the community. So it requires knowing really where people go for information, who are the trusted ambassadors, and who can open doors. So with those recommendations, keep those in mind. We're going to be revisiting complete count committees at the end of this webinar to provide some advice for those who are maybe having a little challenge getting that kick started. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Jacob, and he's going to talk about the huge challenge but also opportunity that comes to enumerator recruitment. Jacob?
Yeah, so thank you, Stephanie. You might ask yourself why we're talking about enumerator recruitment, and Stephanie gave a little bit of a preview into that. It's one of the things that came out of the Rhode Island test as the biggest challenges that the census is facing And it's one of the biggest changes in the census, this first so-called digital census that's happening. Really, the enumerator role has dramatically changed from 2010. The second reason would be it's something that funders and folks involved in Get Out the Count have traditionally not done that much work of. We've heard of different case studies of folks being involved, and certainly the Census partnership team is critically involved in trying to advertise and recruit these roles. But it's something that we feel that there's a little bit of a gap between the conversation that folks are having around the count and the relative importance of these enumerator positions. So first, we want to dive a little deeper into what are the actual requirements and how are they different, as well as just put this in perspective. So to give an idea, 450,000 plus enumerators, right? That is a little bit less than were hired in 2010, but due to some efficiency gains and some of these technology changes. But even so, to put that in perspective, that's roughly the same amount of people as the entire US retail sector hires for the holiday season. It's so big that labor statistics and unemployment statistics have to specifically account for census enumerators when they're calculating things like unemployment rates. This is a really massive operation, and something to just underscore, it's really tough to hire that many people in an environment where there's just overall declining trust in government institutions, as well as an incredibly tight labor market. So this is just an incredible challenge that Census is facing, and certainly has articulated that at numerous public events. So what is this actual position and how is it different, right? So the enumerators, who are also referred to as census takers, you might see that language elsewhere. They're actually the people who go door to door as part of the census's non-response follow-up operations. They're also involved in the so-called transitory location enumeration. So these are like RV parks, homelessness encampments, and other folks that need to be counted who might not actually have addresses. The jobs themselves are really flexible and pay really well, up to $30 an hour in some areas. And they are flexible in the sense that you need to enumerate when folks are home, and that's primarily nights and weekends. So they're really great opportunities for people who already have part-time employment, for example, and so it could be a way of supplementing those sorts of wages. The other thing that's really wonderful about the opportunity is there's actually preferential hiring for people from hard to count areas, which are often disadvantaged communities, disadvantaged populations, and people who have certain self-reported language skills. So, in some respect, communities that are traditionally discriminated against or underemployed in the labor market have even a leg up in getting these positions. The requirements themselves are relatively minimal, as you can see from the slide. You have to be 18 years older, you have to be a US citizen, though that's still not a final determination, but that is the status quo at the time, and the census may still be seeking a waiver for that, as they have in the past, particularly for some language skills. The actual job, since you're going door to door and convincing people to take this survey that they may or may not want to take, you have to have strong interpersonal skills, cultural competency, and problem-solving abilities. Something that's really new for this census, and we want to, it's true for all processes, is really the technology component. So enumerators will actually be using iPhones and an application to do pretty much their entire job. Anything from scheduling the hours where they can work, to doing payroll, to the actual enumeration. It's going to happen on an app for the first time. And that presents some opportunities in the sense that it's a little easier to do. You don't have to carry around paper and do all this sort of stuff. But it obviously raises some digital divide issues as well. It also means that certain traditional sources of enumerators, like retirees or people or older folks who may not be as familiar with technology, may be more difficult to sort of get on an online application and use an iPhone. That might be an additional barrier. Other communities like US veterans, as we were saying, and people from hard to count communities actually get preference. And at the end, there, in addition to the skills you get, there's opportunities to get federal benefits for displaced workers in order to translate this short-term opportunity into a longer-term opportunity to skill up. So just an overview of the actual process, and I'll do this pretty quickly. So for the first time, there's an online combination application and assessment. It's about 30 multiple choice questions that you have to answer. One of the really different things is before you used to have to take almost like an SAT type math and English comprehension test. Now the questions are more like, so here's a paraphrase of a sample question. My previous supervisors would likely describe my self-discipline as superior, above average, average, below average, do not know. So, those types of answers, there's not, necessarily a right answer to that question, but they're more of these kind of personality or behavioral sorts of screens. There's also a fairly lengthy background check period due to a court case against the census arising from the 2010 census, which not only does the census require a background check, but there's now an extended period for you to challenge the findings of that actual background check. Once you clear the actual application process, there's a sort of mixed online and offline training component. So there's 6 to 8 hours of actual online training, and then there's some in-person days that you have to show up, and then there's the actual job. So you'll get issued an iPhone, so it's not something that you have to have, it's something Census will give you, and in that you'll have to do the scheduling. The night before, you'll actually get your assignment, and the addresses that you'll go to are actually given on your phone, and you'll have some check-ins with supervisors who are encouraged to actually have group text messages and other types of check-ins. There's still a little bit to be determined, but you should really think of this as more of like a remote job rather than something where you're going, meeting your supervisor, planning, and then going back out. So, that has its pros and cons. From an efficiency standpoint, it makes the enumerators way more productive, but it is a little more apersonal. It may lead to some more drop-off. Great. So, before we sort of get into this slide, one thing I did want to emphasize is in the Rhode Island test, recruitment was really one of the major challenges. The census had planned to field 1,100 enumerators almost, and they ended up only fielding 735, and over 300 of the enumerators ended up resigning or were terminated for some issue. There were fewer applications than they typically target, so they got closer to 3.5 to 1 ratio of applicants to hires rather than or to target hires rather than a 5 to 1. And folks didn't show up to training at the rates that they thought, and ultimately, had trouble being fielded. And some of this we feel is certainly a challenge, but there's also, due to this change in training, really a ton of opportunities, particularly we feel like for workforce development or for community college students. And part of that is making this pipeline less leaky and drawing on the resources that workforce development have pioneered in order to support applicants through this process, but then also making the opportunity much more attractive, because you're going to have, as the slide discusses, 500,000 folks nearly who have built these sort of skills that Census has paid for, that Census has conducted background checks, which are often expensive for employers to do. You're going to have this tremendous workforce that you can source to get folks who aren't currently in jobs or are underemployed into these new well-paying flexible opportunities, as well as getting these folks who have acquired these new skills into more stable full-time jobs, maybe community college programs, that sort of thing. So we're really, really excited about that. And in fact, we've been working locally with some community colleges and talking about how can we do the kind of skills mapping to get folks who were enumerators more official badges or course credit, that sort of thing, to make these opportunities more attractive. And I think like a central challenge here is sort of making the sort of everything between sourcing, getting people into these jobs, and then giving people opportunities after these jobs, to making that sort of pipeline a little bit more clear and have a little bit more support. Because unfortunately, once people become an enumerator, and they leave the job, there's not that much direct federal support. There's not much handholding that happens there. And we really feel that there's an opportunity for workforce development to both help with the sourcing and then do a little bit more of that handholding to make sure people are able to get the benefits that they may be entitled to, as well as build in some of those additional incentives for doing this kind of job. Yeah, so just what that might look like. This slide's just an illustration of that. So what could workforce development and community college and adult education programs actually do, right? So they can actually do a little of advertising, activate, motivate, and support candidates through the application process, because it is an online process and that may be challenging for some folks. In addition, they can host workshops and actually train them on how to apply, as we were discussing. And finally, provide technology access to the applicants, because a lot of folks don't have computers or broadband at home who might be really, really great fits to be enumerators. And so, a lot of workforce development, libraries, other sorts of institutions that have computer labs, for example, and people who can help, that would be a really great value-added service. And then on the back end, we really feel like there's an opportunity to build a sort of bridge between the enumerator job and local employers. So there might be opportunities to do things like have job fairs for enumerators, supplemental training, and then also to help people get these kind of badges or community college credit or workforce dislocation benefits, like all these sorts of things. They don't just magically come to you. You need to have people help navigate that process. And we really feel like building these incentives on the back end will help Census as it tries to recruit people for these jobs. So we wanted to give a bit of an overview into some of the tools we're building to make this happen, both for the enumerator side as well as the broader get out the count effort. And like, once again, we feel the enumerator side is of particular importance to talk about because, and field staff more generally, because honestly, you can apply for those positions right now. You can log on to Census Jobs, and Claire would love it for you to do that, I'm sure. And those jobs are going to start being fielded for the field staff on scale really this upcoming summer with the address listers, continuing into the fall for this really, really large scale recruitment. So this is something that you can actually do and invest in much sooner in order to address undercount issues, rather than just waiting even until 2020. Already. So then, as far as the solutions that we have, so there's sort of two families of solutions with 4 products. So one is a help desk. So Census will have a telephone number that you can call, certainly for jobs or other questions. But we've been hearing from community partners that they may want to ask questions not through the phone or to other sort of trusted partners and in languages that they speak that are available more 24/7, and so we're investing in collaboration with Census in leveraging some of their great FAQs and other materials to get people the right responses in an easier way. There's a community motivator. So this is something to sort of convert the high touch canvassing and events and other outreach efforts that community-based groups, and I'm sure many of you on the phone, on the webinar, on the phone, will be doing, to actually convert those high touch interactions into digital follow-up through text messages, through check-ins with people to see if they've actually completed the census. more directly to what we were talking about, we're actually building something that will be more of a glue on this pipeline for field staff recruitment that will help provide a really easy way for workforce development, for community colleges, for community-based organizations to source and actually screen potential enumerator candidates, as well as provide support throughout the application process. And then at the end of their enumeration experience, help connect them to the resources they need to leverage some of the new skills that they've acquired. So get those badges, get that community college credit, get connected to workforce development that can help them hone those skills and get better jobs. And the final tool is more around the actual canvassing activities, which is just a really lightweight tool to track and record efforts from the actual field operations as well. So really quickly going through them, we've discussed these at sort of a high level, but the idea is to provide answers and in-person assistance 24/7 with Q&A. So one of the things that we want to do is to have an anonymous way of being able to ask questions, since due to the political environment, there's a lot of sensitivities around things like citizenship question, whether people are required to take the census, those sorts of things that are complicated and people just might not want to ask census. There are easier things like, where do I get a paper form, and other questions that census routinely gets asked that can be answered by sort of a chat bot, but this will also be staffed by volunteers and help sort of triage and direct people to the right census resources, as well as other sorts of answers that may be trickier for census to directly provide. The second tool is this community motivator tool, and this tool is really around leveraging those expensive but really important high-touch interactions. So those in-person conversations canvassers have, the conversations you might have with folks at a community event, where you try to build trust and convince folks to actually take the census and remind them how important it is for funding for their community, like Stephanie was talking about. And so the idea would be to actually enable this sort of follow-up to check in if people have completed the census, help them find libraries and other in-person assistance to actually help them complete it if they're having challenges there, and also do some referrals of friends and that sort of thing. The field staff recruiter we've really talked about, so a lot of this is about sort of nudge messaging, as well as connecting people to trainings of how to complete online applications, videos that can do sort of walkthroughs of how to actually do the censuses. Fairly long application. It takes probably about 30, 40 minutes to complete, as well as helping to connect people to some of these opportunities for badging, employment, and other things afterwards. For folks that don't actually qualify or want to be engaged even beyond the enumerator position, we also want to connect folks to job opportunities that CBOs might, that community-based groups, CBOs and other folks might have around Get Out the Count, as well as volunteer opportunities to do things like staff those events, to do that canvassing if people are particularly civically motivated. The final tool is just a really lightweight way of tracking doors that are sort of knocked, and also connecting people to other tools like the community motivator tool, like the help desk. So if canvassers are able to have a conversation with someone, then hopefully they could try to get their contact information to enroll them in some of those text message or other messaging kind of follow-ups to check in if they've actually completed the census, for example, to see, and also if they do have any questions, to give them information to say, hey, here's a really simple way that you can text into this help desk to get the answers you need. And so that's sort of like the summary of the high level summary of some of the tools that we're building. I think something that's very important for us, and this is just an overall sort of timeline of how these tools kind of and our services match up against the actual census process. So the obviously the enumeration and field staff recruiter is first, and then some of the other tools will be coming online really next year. And I think so I think the actual the other thing to note is that one of the core principles for us with these tools is they will be available through existing platforms like mobile messaging, as well as mobile web and SMS that don't require folks to download an actual app or and use their data plans, that sort of thing, in a heavy use way. That's something we've heard from the folks that we worked with Luca was incredibly important, really making things super accessible and things that are in their own language. Those are the two critical things in reaching and engaging hard to count communities in this sort of process. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Stephanie to introduce Claire.
Great, thanks, Jacob. So we talked about a lot of things just now. We threw a lot of information at you, but to help refocus the discussion, remember we're talking about two distinct challenges here around the census. One, making sure that we are maximizing participation from hard to count communities, and two, ensuring that we have some strong local multilingual enumerators in the pipeline who can do the last part of the count after the self-response is done. So we talked about how to structure hard to count how to structure complete count committees to start thinking about these strategies and to operationalize them. And we talked about some exciting opportunities that we think could be utilized for enumerator recruitment. But a lot of this information can be kind of overwhelming. And so what we have found to be a great first step for a lot of communities that are starting to think about census and starting to prepare are these census solutions workshops that are provided by the Census Bureau. And they have this really cool toolkit available. And Claire is going to speak about how you could use this resource in your community to really start thinking about how these solutions could apply to your community. So Claire, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, awesome. Well, Stephanie and Jacob, thank you so much for inviting me and for having me speak today. All of this information is super helpful. It's great to see other organizations that care about the census as much as we do, and it's really never too early to get started. So I want to thank everyone on the phone for joining. One thing that I want to start in, I want to give a little bit of context to what we're doing now compared to what we did in 2010. So following the 2010 census, some of the partner feedback that we got was that partners wanted a more collaborative role in defining how they'd like to engage with the census. And so that being said, in 2010, we had a partner form that was a very prescriptive form, and any partner that would be a national partner or a local partner would fill it out and basically check off anything that they were willing to do to advance and spread awareness around the census. So it could be doing a blog series, posting something on social media, given that the climate of social media has changed so much. But that just gives you an idea of how prescriptive things were. So with some of the feedback that we got from partners and just us adapting to the changes to social media, and this being the first ever digital census, we came up with these census solutions workshops. And these are workshops that bring together different partners and different community members into a room together to discuss certain issues that they see and that they foresee as challenges for their specific communities. And I think what really works with these workshops is that it really shows how much we rely on our national partners and our local partners as trusted voices in our communities. As a census, we understand that right now we're in a climate where there's a heavy distrust of government. And so we really rely on our trusted voices to be able to relay the message and the importance of being counted, what it means for your community, and the importance of being counted. And we really depend on these trusted voices and these trusted organizations to be able to host these events and work with the partners and audience members to come to some sort of conclusion or come to some sort of action plan to be able to start their engagement and really kind of plan out how they intend to participate with us towards 2020. So on this slide, you'll see a couple of screenshots of our toolkit. I believe that you guys also got it as an attachment, but with this toolkit, we've really tried to make it as simple as possible. And also, us as Census, we try to take a very behind the scenes role. As I said, we understand that you guys know when I mean you guys, I mean partners, they know the audience is the best, and they know the sorts of engagement and the language and barriers that are going to be challenging for community members and for them to count their communities. And so we try to take a very behind the scene role, but we support and we show and we provide this toolkit as a means to really get this done. So you'll see a couple of sheets that I think are really instrumental to doing the workshop. There's a sheet that really outlines how to run a workshop. There are sheets that outline perspective agendas. This is what you could do. These are mock agendas. We also have a couple of worksheets that describe past workshops that we've done and some case studies that really help paint a picture of the workshop, what you can do, who you can invite, and so forth. And you'll also, right below the main picture, the planning timeline, that is also really helpful in understanding when should I send out invitations, when should I begin spreading the word. So we really try to make sure everything is in one place for this workshop. Next slide, please. Great, and this is a couple other documents that we've shared in the toolkit. One thing is sample agendas. Some of these workshops, we've seen them last for a 9 to 3 time frame, but we've also seen workshops that have been done from 9 to 11. So once again, it really depends on knowing your audience and knowing what works for them and being able to help create that for the audience. I think another really great thing with these workshops is that we, in our role as national partners, as a national partnership program, we really try to be matchmakers. So for example, if a partner comes to us and says, we want to host a workshop focusing on recruitment efforts in Mississippi, or how can we best recruit, or we want to focus on the undercount of young children, but for example, they might not have or know of a partner that's going to be working on that. And so ideally, we will we'll have other ideas for partners and help match them to make sure that they have the audiences that they want in the room to really address that issue. Next slide, please. Great. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with design thinking. For me, this was a whole brand new thing, but the word is very fancy, but honestly, it's very much what we do on a daily basis. So anything from understanding your user, building scenarios, testing, implementation. But for us, the biggest thing with design thinking, and design thinking is what really drives the Census Solution workshop. It's the methodology behind the workshops, but it's this element of empathy and understanding who is the user, who is my audience, and what are tools or programs that I can create for that user. It's something that's been used a lot in the tech world and retail, but the main component of it is really understanding who your user is, defining some of those issues, ideating, which is something that you do throughout the workshop, building things on sticky notes, posting them up, voting on ideas, then you're prototyping, you're testing the ideas, and then by the end of the workshop, you're ideally one step closer to implementing those ideas that you've come up with. Next slide, please. Here are a couple of the workshop objectives that we have and that we share with every single partner when we're working with them to build this workshop. So obviously build connections. We think it's a really wonderful thing when you're able to come in a room with different people that you wouldn't normally work with. That being said, you could have partners that represent retail companies, and you also have partners representing advocacy groups. And it's rare to find partners, I think, across the spectrum in one room together, really ideating and coming together about how they can collaborate on certain issues. The second part is develop actionable concepts. And that is really work on creating action items and things that are actually feasible to get done to your specific audiences. Third is build momentum. So come up with ideas and contributions that can really start and last from now until 2020. And then finally, showcase a model. What we've tried to build and what we've tried to work on with partners is creating a model that can be replicated and used not just in Mississippi, but in Seattle and in Boston and in Hazard County, Kentucky. So really working to build a model, something that's sustainable and something that works for every audience. Next slide, please. So I wanted to show a slide on one of the workshops that we did in Providence, Rhode Island. We did this actually in the middle of the end-to-end test in April of this year, and it brought together the National Urban League, Annie Casey Foundation, the American Library Association, Rhode Island Kids Count, some of the library organizations, and then the Children's Leadership Council. And I wanted to show this slide just as a mock example of what we were able to achieve and how we came about it. So we were approached by the National Urban League, and they wanted to focus on an event in Providence. They wanted to focus it on one of the hard to count communities, which is African American males between the ages of 18 and 34. We also got involved with Annie Casey Foundation that wanted to focus on the undercount of young children. So collectively, we brought all of these partners together. We served as the matchmakers, and then when there were missing gaps, these partners also brought in more partners. And ideally, they came together and they sent out the invitations, they built out a guest list, and they really ran the show. We had census representatives there present to do a Census 101. Oftentimes for these events, they might request a data dissemination specialist, and we're happy to provide that. There's one in every region. There's more than one in every region. And these data dissemination specialists can provide really thorough and in-depth data presentations on that specific area. And we find that to be incredibly successful and useful in these workshops because it really brings home the power of data, but also the power of census data and what it does. And it's also helpful to see some of the discrepancies. So seeing how low are we in our undercount and how many people participated in census in 2010. So it also helps inform any sort of strategy that you're building for the upcoming 2020 census. And so a couple of these organizations, I'm not going to read them out loud, but they were all part of this event. And then the example of commitments, or what we call contributions, are putting things on the agenda, planning a race, providing tablets or iPads to libraries, as libraries are such a hub of resources, but they also serve as community centers. And so a partner had an idea about how can we find a funder to supply libraries in our county with tablets or iPads to assist in the census count. So these were all some of the contributions that came from this Providence, Rhode Island event. And we're now working with these partners to really implement them and make sure that they have the resources and tools and information they need to put them into action. Next slide, please. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to highlight that the crux of these workshops are these challenge statements. And challenge statements, they're also referred to as how might we statements. And it's looking at an issue in your respective community and framing it or tailoring it in a how might we statement. So you're looking at the issue of recruitment, or you're looking at the issue of the digital divide. So you just would tweak that issue into a question, and then those questions would be what you'd be working on throughout your day-long event or your workshop. And ideally, when you fill out your contribution sheets, you are addressing some of these issues and also detailing your plan or your intention to address these issues. Next slide, please. And these last slides are just a couple of pictures that show some of the past workshops we've done. I believe this one was in Silicon Valley. And if you go to the next slide, I think that one shows some other, yes. So this is a common exercise that some of the participants were doing, and it's writing things out on sticky notes and then putting them up on a board with the other group members. You vote on an idea or you vote on a concept, and then you work towards that concept. And then by the end of the session, you have a plan, or you share out your idea on how to address that issue. Next slide. At the end of the session, there's a component of the schedule that focuses on the share outs, and that is what this gentleman is doing here. Is he and his group, they've come up with this plan, they've come up with this strategy on an issue, and they draw it out. You can also act it out. If you're like me, you're not the best artist. Most of my things are in stick figures. But it's an opportunity to really draw out your idea in your storyboard, and potentially go back to your organizations or your companies and say, hey, I really want to commit to this, and this is what I would like to do, or this is how I see us being effective in raising awareness around the 2020 census. Next slide, please. And so last, this is our census, our website, and also our email address. And then there's my information below, but please feel free to reach out to me if you are interested in hosting a workshop or you want more information. But we really love these workshops. I think it's been a great way to get partners involved. Even if you don't want the census involved, that's absolutely fine. We oftentimes get emails from partners that have said, hey, these are the contribution sheets from our workshop. Please see them, but we didn't actually take part in any of it. And I think it's really wonderful because the toolkit has all that information. And as I said, these partners, they know their audiences and they know the impact or the negative impact that having census there would do. And so they're able to do this themselves, and they feel incredibly empowered by being able to offer this service to their participants and community members, and really create an action plan. So I'm happy to be here, and thank you for this time, and I'll hand it back to Stephanie.
Great, thanks so much, Claire. We love these workshops. I was actually in Salt Lake County last week, was it? Or maybe 2 weeks ago, facilitating one of these. We love finding time to do these. We were recently in King County and also did one in Silicon Valley. But just to see the different types of community members who are able to come together. There's always funders in the room, there are community-based organizations, there are local businesses that are all putting their heads together around this common cause. A creative thing that Salt Lake City did with these workshops was that they used their contribution sheets to actually get a more of a next step sort of thing with their attendees. They made them as subcommittee sign-up sheets. And so they turned each challenge question into a subcommittee. And then the ideas that were floated up there, they actually all committed to moving and meeting next to continue to discuss how to operationalize the ideas that they came up with, and also how to find the resources to support them. So Claire, thank you so much again for presenting on this toolkit. We'll be sure to send it around when we send out the slides and the webinar recording. But right now I want to take some time to address some questions that are coming in. Everyone, if you see the questions box on the side of your, let me pull it up here, at the side of the webinar panel, you'll see a place where you could type in questions. So take a minute to write those in, send them over, and then Claire, if you could stay unmuted, I'll try and triage these and direct them to the appropriate person to weigh in. So let me take 30 seconds for people to write in some questions, and then we'll start reading them out. Okay, great. So we already have some really good questions coming in. This one, let me send it over to Jacob. And so this was a question around the languages that are supported in the 2020 census. What language will be available, and what additional language supports will there be needed by the community?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, the paper form itself will only be available in English and Spanish. However, there will be 13 other languages supported by phone, or I don't have lists quite there, but we can send around some information on what those will be. And they're basically the most common language that are spoken in the United States. If you do have local communities, local immigrant communities are not represented, I would assume that you might have to provide some additional language assistance there. In addition to those 13 languages, there's going to be these language assistance guides available both to the enumerators and then more generally to people completing the applications in 59 languages. So a much larger group, but obviously that's not representative entirely of the country, so it will vary depending on your local community.
Great, thanks. This is another question that I think is more of a Jacob question, and it's about the enumerator app. If there's been opportunities for us to view and test the 2020 Census enumerator app, Jacob?
Yeah, and the short answer is we haven't. That said, there is a demo of the enumerator tool and sort of a mock enumeration that the Census did at their public meeting, at their program management review. That's available on YouTube, and that's something that we'd be happy to send around. And Claire, feel free to jump in if there's any other resources you know of.
Sure.
Sorry, Claire, go ahead.
Oh, no, I don't, at the top of my head, I don't, but I will follow up with you and see if I can get you something.
Okay, great. Another question related to enumerators. Someone asked if we could reiterate what the hiring timeline is for enumerators. So I could answer that really quickly. The application will open in September 2019, and then it'll be open through February 2020. Great. So these are really good questions that are coming in. Here's an interesting one. Do we foresee any problems with the number of household residents who may be rostered on the 2020 census paper form, which is 10, compared with the 12 people on the 2010 census? This might be a Jacob/Claire question. Jacob, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I mean, the short answer is, it is definitely an issue with any sort of survey design if you're truncating a roster. And I think that that's particularly an issue for housing units that have unconventional housing. So like an unaddressed in-law unit, for example, technically that household should not only count the folks living in the main house, the main unit, but also other families who might live in unaddressed units. And so for those sorts of situations, it's particularly acute. I will say advocates tend to point to almost the other problem, which is people being left off the roster entirely, not just because there's an upper limit. So like the undercount of children that Claire alluded to. In addition, there's some concerns, particularly for so-called complex families where there might be someone mixed immigration status, so folks who are undocumented or folks on work visas. There's some fear that those people will be left out. But I'll let Claire add anything she has to say on the truncating the actual roster.
So I'm a little embarrassed. I don't know about that right now. That's something that I will also have to get back to you on.
No problem. It's such a learning process for all of us, right? There's always that other question that we have to look into.
I know, you always feel a little less smart with new questions.
What I would say is, and Claire can also speak to this, but the Census has invested a ton of efforts in its deduplication process. Yeah. So, and there's a brand new non-ID processing. So if someone does live in an unconventional address, they can still fill out the census form, even if they haven't gotten a form mailed to them. And so this is sort of an opportunity for folks who might be living in these unconventional units that's relatively new for them to fill out the census, include some information about the type of housing they live in, and ensure that they're counted. And I think Census's efforts on deduplication and sort of preventing an overcount are really robust. And it's something that obviously community groups don't have access to. So I think getting more people to fill out the applications is a great way to sort of help alleviate some of those roster concerns.
Great. We're getting a lot of questions about enumerators. Let me clarify again. The enumerators are going to be hired by the U.S. Census Bureau. So they are not going to be hired by city governments or county governments. They're not going to be hired by CommunityConnect labs. They're all going to be federal employees. And so they have to go through the USA Jobs online portal, and you could find more information on that online, but they're all going through the government job application process. There was a question here around the federal background check requirement to be eligible for census jobs. Jacob, do you want to take a stab at that question?
Yeah, and Claire should definitely chime in on this. I think the short answer is the actual requirements haven't been released, and that's something that we've been asking Census to do. You know, I will say, if you look at sort of, they are going to be federal employees, as Stephanie indicated, and so if you look at the sort of Office of Personnel Management requirements and those sorts of questions, they tend to ask about criminal history going back 7 years, and tend to ask more about felonies. So, you know, I wouldn't take that as the guidelines, but we imagine that it would be something, you know, that's not more restrictive than that, certainly.
Yes, no, that's correct.
Great. Thanks, Claire and Jacob. Here's a question for Claire. Would you be able to share about some of the design thinking ideas that floated up from the Census Solutions workshops, particularly around how to encourage self-response in communities where maybe there's low internet access?
Sure. So I will say, I mean, these workshops have been incredibly successful with a lot of the grassroots organizations, given their focus and how they engage with communities. They have been incredibly helpful to us as we've also been learning to put these on. I think we did one in Hazard County, Kentucky, and this one was really focused on the digital divide and making sure that there's more awareness and information and kind of resource centers given the digital divide, and that this is going to be the first totally online one. I do want to reiterate that even we're saying that it is 100% online, but you still can fill it out on paper if that is your preference. You also can fill it out on the phone, as that's another opportunity. But one of the things that came out of the Hazard County Census Solution Workshop was there was a local utility company, and the owner of the utility company actually came to this workshop, and he talked about the importance of local business, and he basically wrote on his contribution sheet that he is planning on putting a reminder to fill out your census form on your utility bill. So every time you have a paper utility bill, there's going to be a reminder. But some of the other ideas that came out were there were firemen there, and so the ideas of how can we maybe at the fire station have an iPad or have a computer set up for community members to come in and fill it out there. Another thing that has been really successful and a strong idea that's been going through has been this idea of census day parties, and that would be bringing people to one place. So having the library host it. The libraries really serve as these kind of cultural and community hubs, and they also have computers and they have Wi-Fi. And so if you are in an area where you don't have great Wi-Fi and there's a huge digital disconnect, many people go to the library for those resources. And we have been actively involved with the American Library Association, the Public Library Association, and some of the other library networks to ensure some sort of arrangement so that there will be computers and some of the librarians will have the information they need to answer any questions. So those are some of the ideas that came out of the Hazard Kentucky one. But I think you'll see similar ideas coming from other workshops. So those are just a couple of examples.
Great, thanks, Claire. And gosh, there's so much to discuss and we're already coming up on the hour. We do have a lot of information on censusoutreach.org, especially if you're thinking about trying to mobilize funders or mobilize community-based organizations or approach folks. Feel free to explore our website. Feel free to send me an email Claire about the workshops. In the meantime, we did get the citizenship question asked a few times here, so I want to take this last minute to address if there's any updates on the citizenship question. So
yeah, there was also, the question was, will it be a problem if it's not answered? And then any updates on that. So I might kick that to Claire for more of the official census response on that.
Sure. So the official census response is, given that it is constitutionally mandated, we ask and we believe in a totally accurate census. And in that way, we encourage and want every question to be filled in. I can stress the confidentiality factor. Every census employee or contractor takes a oath of loyalty for however long they live, and so all of that data is protected. I think there's still many of the lawsuits that are going through right now, so we don't have any more information on if it's going to be on the census, or so we don't have a definite answer. But that is just some context and some information. Ideally, one of the things that is mentioned is that some community members find it even more invasive, that oftentimes if you don't fill out that question, or if any question is not filled out, you usually have someone coming up for non-response follow-up. And so many community members find that even more invasive, having someone knock on their door when they're already concerned about government and data confidentiality and security. But that is the latest update in terms of the citizenship question.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, just as a fact, the census does, like, people skip all sorts of questions on the census and American Community Survey and what have you. It's something that's true of any survey. So it's one of those things where it's not like your survey is not going to count. Your census is not going to count if you choose not to fill out that question. But at the same time, I think what Claire says stands as far as the census's official position.
great. And on that note, thank you so much to everyone for spending this hour with us. As a reminder, we will send a follow-up email with the slides, the webinar recording, and then a few of the resources that we mentioned in this discussion. When you close this window, you will see a quick survey that pops up. This will help us a lot. So if you could take just a few seconds to fill that out, that would be great. And then, as always, feel free to reach out. We love speaking with all the cities and counties and communities and organizations that are so activated around census, and we look forward to continuing the discussion and helping to ensure that complete count. Thanks, everyone.